Hey everyone, tonight we're diving deep into a dark chapter of history, not the stories of kings or wars, but the haunting world of Victorian asylums, how a system meant to heal instead trapped and destroyed countless lives. Before you settle in, please hit like and subscribe only if you truly appreciate the content, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to connect with all of you across the globe now. Find a quiet spot, maybe dim the lights, or play some soft background noise, and let's step carefully into the chilling reality of how the Victorian asylum system changed lives forever. The woman locked away for postpartum depression in the shadows of history. Behind the closed doors of asylums and mental hospitals, countless women endured a silent nightmare that few dared to speak of. After giving life, many new mothers found themselves branded not as caregivers, but as patients locked away under cruel labels like hysteria, nervous exhaustion, or the catch-all diagnosis of madness. This is the untold story of women institutionalized for what we now understand as postpartum depression, a story that exposes the dark intersections of medicine, gender, and power in society. Postpartum depression, the deep emotional and psychological struggle following childbirth, was not always recognized as an illness born of hormonal shifts, trauma, or isolation. Instead, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the female mind was shrouded in mystique and misunderstanding. Medical science, filtered through patriarchal lenses, frequently dismissed women's mental anguish as a weakness or moral failing. The term hysteria itself, rooted in the ancient Greek word for uterus, reflected a belief that women's emotions and sanity were dangerously tied to their reproductive organs. When a mother failed to conform to the ideal of calm, nurturing motherhood, the system stepped in not to heal, but to control. Thousands of women were sent to asylums under the guise of treatment. But these institutions, far from sanctuaries of care, often became prisons. Conditions inside were brutal: overcrowding, neglect, harsh treatments like cold baths, restraints, and even electroshock therapy. Doctors and attendants frequently ignored the individual needs of the women, treating them as objects of pathology rather than human beings in crisis. The social stigma surrounding mental illness compounded the isolation these women felt once institutionalized. Many faced the grim reality that they might never return home. One of the most haunting aspects of this history is the ambiguity of diagnoses. A woman overwhelmed by exhaustion, grief, or anxiety after childbirth could easily be labeled hysterical or nervous and institutionalized indefinitely. The fine line between understandable postpartum suffering and supposed insanity was blurred by gendered prejudices and limited medical knowledge. In many cases, the mother's own family was complicit, consigning her to asylums either out of fear, shame, or the inability to cope. The fear of female mental instability was pervasive and reflected wider societal anxieties about women stepping outside prescribed roles. The ideal mother was resilient, cheerful, and self-sacrificing, silently bearing the physical and emotional toll of childbirth. When reality clashed with this ideal, the woman was marked as a problem to be contained. Institutionalization became a tool to manage not just illness, but social conformity. History records tragic individual stories: women who were vibrant, intelligent, and creative before childbirth, only to be erased by the asylum's walls. Some were detained for decades, their pleas unheard. Their children often grew up without their mothers, torn apart by the very system that promised healing. The emotional cost reverberated across generations, a legacy of trauma rarely acknowledged. It was only gradually, through advances in psychiatry and growing feminist critique, that postpartum depression began to be recognized as a legitimate medical condition. Early pioneers like Dr. Grace Palethorpe and later researchers challenged the notion of female madness as hysteria and called for compassionate, specialized care. Yet, even today, stigma around maternal mental health persists, echoing the silence of those women locked away so long ago. Understanding this painful history is crucial, not to dwell in despair, but to honor the resilience of those women and to remind us how far we have come, and how far we still must go. Their stories compel us to question how society treats vulnerability and mental illness, especially when it intersects with gender. They warn us of the dangers when compassion is replaced by control, when healing is sacrificed to conformity. As you listen, imagine the countless mothers whose cries were muffled by the cold stone of asylums, whose pain was met with suspicion rather than empathy. Remember that behind every diagnosis was a human being, fearful, suffering, and deserving of dignity. This is their legacy. A call to ensure that no mother is ever again silenced or imprisoned for the natural complexities of bringing life into the world. The girl imprisoned for being too talkative. Euphemia Wilson's story is a haunting echo from a past where misunderstanding, fear, and cruelty intertwined in the shadows of mental health and social control. At just 14 years old, Euphemia was committed to an asylum, not for violence, not for crime, but for something so simple, yet so devastating: talking too much. Excessive speech, her records say. A girl imprisoned for energy, for liveliness, for the pure human urge to express herself. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, mental health was a fragile and misunderstood field. Institutions, often called asylums, were places not just of treatment, but of confinement and punishment. Girls like Euphemia, bright, talkative, energetic, were often labeled hysterical or nervous, diagnoses rooted more in social control than medicine. Euphemia's endless talking was seen not as a sign of life, but as a symptom of madness. She spent 62 years behind the cold walls of that institution, from the innocence of childhood through the weight of adulthood, a lifetime stolen by a system that did not understand her. Imagine the silence forced upon her, the isolation, the loss of the world outside. A girl who once filled rooms with her voice was reduced to silence in a cage. Her commitment was less about illness and more about discomfort. Discomfort that society felt toward a young woman who did not conform to the quiet, obedient ideal expected of her. To be talkative was to be unruly, dangerous, and in need of control. Euphemia's story is a grim reflection of a time when women's voices were often silenced, literally and figuratively. This pattern was far from rare. Across the Western world, thousands of women, many mere girls, were institutionalized for behaviors that challenged social norms. Speaking out, expressing emotion, even simply having too much energy could be twisted into a justification for lifelong imprisonment. Euphemia became one of the many invisible victims of what historians now call the era of moral insanity. Where nonconformity was pathologized, records reveal that Euphemia's family, perhaps overwhelmed or pressured by social stigma, consented, or even initiated her confinement. Often, families saw institutionalization as a way to protect reputation or avoid scandal, especially for girls whose spirited nature clashed with societal expectations. Once inside, patients like Euphemia were subjected to treatments that ranged from neglect to harsh physical restraint, and rarely was there genuine care or understanding. In the quiet halls of the asylum, Euphemia's voice was swallowed by routine and silence. Years passed, decades stretched on. The world outside changed dramatically: wars, revolutions, technological revolutions. Yet Euphemia remained trapped in a static limbo, a prisoner not of a crime, but of misunderstanding. Her story forces us to confront the dark side of history, where power imbalances allowed institutions to control and erase individual freedom under the guise of treatment. It is a story about the dangers of labeling human differences as illness, especially when those differences are inconvenient to prevailing social norms. Euphemia's imprisonment also highlights how young women were doubly vulnerable, marginalized by age and gender, while men might be institutionalized for violence or mental illness. Women were more often locked away for moral reasons: talking too much, being too emotional, refusing to submit. This systemic silencing was a tool of patriarchal control, a mechanism to enforce obedience and silence dissent. Today, Euphemia Wilson's name is largely forgotten, but her story echoes loudly as a warning. It reminds us how crucial it is to protect individual rights and dignity in mental health care. It forces us to question the labels we use, to remember that behind every diagnosis is a human being, with a voice and a story that deserves to be heard. Her fate challenges modern viewers to reflect how many voices are still silenced today, not by walls, but by stigma, neglect, or misunderstanding. How often do we dismiss energy, liveliness, or outspoken nature as problems rather than strengths? Euphemia's life urges us to listen more carefully to those who speak differently or loudly, to value all expressions of humanity. In remembering Euphemia Wilson, we honor not only a girl lost to an unjust system, but the resilience of the human spirit. Despite decades of silence and confinement, the truth of her life breaks through time, reminding us that no one should ever be imprisoned for simply being themselves, for simply talking too much, for simply existing with energy and voice. Her story is a testament to the need for compassion over control, for understanding over fear. It is a call to never repeat the mistakes of the past, and to ensure that the mistakes of silencing a young girl for talking too much are never forgotten. The ice bath that broke a man's mind in the dark corridors of early psychiatry. A brutal treatment emerged that promised to shock madness from the minds of the afflicted. This method was the ice bath, a practice that subjected vulnerable patients to prolonged immersion in freezing water, often for hours at a time. It was believed that the intense cold would jolt the body and mind, disrupting psychosis, hysteria, or what doctors then called mental illness. But beneath this cold veneer of science was a terrifying reality. Many patients endured agonizing hypothermia, convulsions, and coma. Some never fully returned from the icy abyss. To understand how this treatment arose, we must first journey to the 19th and early 20th centuries, a time when mental health care was in its infancy. Psychiatry was a fledgling field, searching desperately for cures in a world that offered little understanding of the brain's complexities. Asylums were overcrowded, understaffed, and often brutal. Treatments were experimental, sometimes more about control than cure. The ice bath emerged as part of a broader category called hydrotherapy, the therapeutic use of water in various forms, from warm baths to cold compresses. Hydrotherapy had roots stretching back centuries, praised for its supposed cleansing and revitalizing properties. But the ice bath was more than a simple cold plunge. It was designed as a violent shock to the nervous system. Doctors believed that mental illness was a form of overstimulation or agitation of the nervous system. The ice bath, by causing a sudden, extreme drop in body temperature, aimed to reset the nervous system's erratic signals. The theory was that this cold shock would extinguish the pathological fire of madness, like a plunge into icy water, quenching a raging flame. Patients, however, were not mere subjects of theory. Men, women, and sometimes children were forcibly submerged in vats or tubs filled with ice and water, their bodies exposed to temperatures just above freezing. Sessions could last from minutes to hours, depending on the institution and the patient's supposed condition. Often, the patient's body was immersed up to the neck, leaving only the head above water. Staff would watch carefully, fearing drowning or the onset of hypothermia. But the human body is not designed for such punishment. Prolonged exposure to near-freezing water disrupts the body's vital functions. The heart rate slows dramatically, breathing becomes shallow and erratic, and the muscles stiffen uncontrollably. Hypothermia sets in a life-threatening drop in core temperature that impairs brain function and leads to loss of consciousness. For many patients, the ice bath was not a cure, but a descent into a dangerous coma-like state. Reports from the era reveal grim scenes, patients shivering uncontrollably, turning pale and blue, their teeth chattering as their bodies fought the cold. Some entered convulsions, their muscles trembling violently. Others slipped into unconsciousness and never fully woke. Yet, because the treatment was regarded as successful if it subdued agitation or psychotic episodes, these traumatic responses were often interpreted as signs of its efficacy. One particularly chilling example comes from the infamous psychiatric hospitals in Europe, where ice baths were administered repeatedly as a form of restraint. Rather than sedating patients with drugs, doctors opted for these frigid sessions to control violent or uncontrollable individuals. The suffering was profound, and many patients emerged with worsened mental states or irreversible physical damage. Beyond the physical toll, the psychological impact was devastating. Imagine the terror of being plunged into freezing water, unable to move, trapped by your own helplessness. The ice bath was not just a treatment. It was an assault on the senses and psyche. For patients already vulnerable to mental anguish, this experience often deepened their trauma. It is crucial to recognize that the ice bath treatment was not an isolated quirk, but part of a broader pattern of misguided and often cruel interventions in psychiatric history. These treatments reflected the limited medical knowledge of the time and the desperate attempts to impose order on chaotic minds. Yet, despite their brutal nature, they reveal a poignant truth. The historical struggle to understand and heal mental illness was often marred by suffering inflicted in the name of cure. Thankfully, modern psychiatry has long since abandoned such practices, replaced by evidence-based therapies and medications grounded in neuroscience and compassion. Yet, the legacy of ice baths and similar treatments remains a stark reminder of how far we have come and how easily fear and ignorance can pave the way for cruelty. As we reflect on these dark chapters, we must remember the individuals who endured them. Not merely patients, but human beings whose minds and bodies were subjected to coldness, both literal and metaphorical. Their stories compel us to pursue mental health care with empathy, respect, and a deep commitment to do no harm. The ice bath that broke a man's mind is more than history. It is a cautionary tale of medicine's shadows and the enduring human quest for healing amidst suffering. The asylum, where silence was mandatory in the shadowed corridors of Victorian asylums. A chilling rule echoed with the silence of despair. No talking. This was not a mere guideline, but a rigid mandate enforced with ruthless severity. Patients were stripped of their voices, not simply to quiet the chaos of the wards, but as a form of control. A brutal method intended to tame minds already fraying at the edges. The silence was mandatory, and those who dared to speak were often punished, harshly baptized, isolated, confined in rooms where the darkness swallowed sound itself. This enforced muteness was believed to calm agitation and disorder, yet its effects were far more sinister, accelerating the very mental collapse it sought to prevent. Victorian psychiatry was still in its infancy, struggling to understand the complexities of the human mind. Asylums, ostensibly places of healing, frequently became prisons where fear and misunderstanding ruled. The no-talking rule was born from a misguided attempt to impose order on patients deemed dangerous or uncontrollable. Silence, they believed, could suppress disruptive behavior, reduce stimuli, and promote tranquility. But what they failed to grasp was the fundamental human need for expression, for connection, for voice. To silence a mind in torment was to deepen its isolation, to starve it of the social and emotional lifelines that sustain sanity. The roots of this practice lie in the broader Victorian attitudes toward mental illness. Madness was feared, stigmatized, and hidden from society's view. The asylum was a space where the insane were segregated, often without hope of release. The language of the time was harsh and dehumanizing, describing patients as monsters, madmen, or lunatics. This framing justified extreme measures. Silence was weaponized to strip patients of autonomy and identity. Without speech, they became shadows, living ghosts, whose inner lives were inaccessible, and whose suffering went unnoticed. Historical records reveal harrowing accounts of patients subjected to enforced silence. Those who spoke were met with gags, leather straps, or cloth bindings that muffled their cries. Isolation cells, sometimes called the dark rooms, confined patients for days, weeks, even months, with nothing but the cold walls to witness their descent. The deprivation of speech was a form of sensory and emotional starvation, intensifying feelings of helplessness and despair. Many patients, once vocal and responsive, gradually retreated into muteness, their minds unraveling in the oppressive quiet. Medical staff often believed that silence could help patients achieve a form of mental rest, a pause from the chaos of their thoughts and behaviors. This belief aligned with the period's emerging ideas of moral treatment, which emphasized discipline, routine, and order. However, the silence imposed was far from therapeutic. It was enforced, punitive, and total. Patients had no choice but to endure, as resistance brought punishment or further isolation. The very act of speaking became a rebellion, a threat to the asylum's strict regimen. The psychological impact of enforced silence is profound. Speech is not merely a tool for communication, but a vital mechanism for processing trauma, asserting identity, and connecting with others. When denied the ability to speak, patients were cut off from social interaction and the catharsis that comes with expression. This sensory deprivation could trigger hallucinations, paranoia, and profound depression. The mind, starved of its voice, spiraled into confusion and despair. The asylum, intended as a place of healing, often became a chamber of madness intensified by silence. One must consider the power dynamics at play. The asylum staff held absolute authority over patients, and silence was a means to suppress dissent. It silenced complaints, screams, and pleas for help. This control extended beyond behavior to the very essence of personhood. Patients reduced to mute compliance were easier to manage. Their humanity diminished in the eyes of their captors. The no talking rule thus served to reinforce the social hierarchies of the time, marginalizing the mentally ill as invisible and voiceless. The historical context also reflects the limited medical knowledge and harsh societal norms of the Victorian era. Mental health was misunderstood, and treatments were often experimental and cruel. The focus was on containment rather than cure. Enforced silence was just one of many brutal tactics employed. Alongside physical restraints, isolation, and even electrotherapy, it was a time when compassion was scarce and fear dictated policy. Yet, amidst this bleak history, there are stories of resilience. Some patients found ways to communicate silently through gestures, writing, or subtle expressions, fighting to retain their sense of self, despite the crushing silence imposed upon them. Their silent resistance is a testament to the indomitable human spirit yearning to be heard, understood, and acknowledged. Reflecting on this dark chapter raises critical questions about the ethics of psychiatric care and the dangers of dehumanization. The enforced silence of Victorian asylums serves as a haunting reminder of what happens when fear overrides empathy, when control replaces compassion. It underscores the essential truth that healing requires voice, connection, and respect for dignity. Modern mental health care has thankfully moved beyond such barbaric practices, embracing communication, dialogue, and patient-centered approaches. But the echoes of those silent halls linger as a cautionary tale. They remind us that silence imposed from outside is not peace, but a form of violence that can destroy the fragile mind. The asylum where silence was mandatory was not a sanctuary, but a prison of quiet suffering. It is a chapter in history we must remember to honor those silenced souls and to ensure that no one's voice is ever forcibly taken away in the name of treatment again. The man who faked madness and regretted it in the dim, shadowed world of Victorian asylums, a place both feared and misunderstood. One man dared to cross the threshold not as a patient, but as a reporter. He was a journalist, armed with courage and a pen, determined to expose the brutal conditions hidden behind the cold walls of mental institutions. But what he did not anticipate was how the asylum itself would begin to consume him, turning his quest for truth into a harrowing nightmare of confusion and despair. In the 19th century, mental health treatment was primitive and often cruel. Asylums were designed not to heal, but to isolate those deemed mad by society's harsh standards. Patients were shackled, silenced, and subjected to treatments that today would be considered barbaric. Society feared madness, and so it locked away the afflicted in places where darkness thrived, not just in the cells, but in the very attitudes of those who guarded them. The journalist, whose name history barely records, volunteered for an unprecedented experiment to feign insanity and gain entry into one such asylum. His mission was clear: to shine a light on the inhumane treatment endured by the patients. He meticulously studied the symptoms and behaviors that would convince doctors and attendants of his supposed madness. Slurred speech, erratic movements, nonsensical ramblings, all carefully rehearsed performances in the theater of deception. Upon admission, the man entered a world unlike anything he had known. The asylum was a labyrinth of despair, its corridors echoing with cries and whispers of the forgotten. He witnessed the thin line between sanity and madness blur as the patients, stripped of dignity, became shadows of themselves. The conditions were brutal: overcrowded rooms, unsanitary facilities, and a staff often indifferent or cruel. The atmosphere was thick with neglect, fear, and a chilling silence that pressed down on every soul inside. Yet, the greatest danger was not the environment alone, but the suffocating power of the institution itself. The man's carefully crafted act soon trapped him. His pleas of sanity were dismissed, his protests recorded as delusions. The doctors, trained in the limited and often flawed medical knowledge of the time, saw his behavior only through the lens of madness. His identity dissolved into the role he had assumed. Every attempt to explain his true self only tightened. The invisible chains of confinement. Isolation was a weapon wielded with ruthless efficiency. Patients, including our journalist, were subjected to solitary confinement, a torment designed to break the mind. Hours, days, weeks spent in silence and darkness, eroding the fragile boundary between reality and hallucination. The man's mind, once sharp and clear, began to fracture. The desperation of being unheard and disbelieved gnawed at his spirit. Physical treatments added to the psychological torment. The era's medical interventions ranged from bloodletting and purging to ice baths and restraints. These therapies were less about healing and more about control, often leaving patients weakened or worse. Our journalist witnessed fellow inmates subjected to these measures, their cries muffled by the cold walls. He himself was not spared the staff's suspicion and harsh discipline extended to anyone who dared challenge their authority. His journalistic instincts drove him to document everything in secret, smuggling notes, memorizing details, recording names and abuses. But even as he gathered evidence, the line between his real self and the madness he feigned blurred dangerously. The asylum was a machine designed to consume identity and spit out silence. Escape, even in mind or memory, was a battle he fought daily. After months, the journalist was finally released, but not unscathed. The trauma endured in those walls left deep scars. His sanity questioned, his spirit battered. He struggled to reclaim his place in a world that seemed alien. His story, when published, shocked the public and exposed the grim realities of institutionalized mental illness. But his personal ordeal became a cautionary tale about the perilous boundary between sanity and madness, and how society's fear can imprison even the innocent. This man's journey reveals the darkest corners of Victorian mental health care, a system more interested in containment than cure, where silence was enforced, and voices were lost in the echo of stone corridors. It reminds us how fragile identity can be when confined by walls and disbelief, and how easily truth can be swallowed by the machinery of fear. Today, his sacrifice is a testament to the power of truth-seeking and the importance of compassion. In mental health, his story compels us to remember the human lives behind the labels, to challenge the systems that silence suffering, and to honor the resilience of those who survive not just illness, but the institutions meant to protect them. The asylum that once threatened to consume him instead became a haunting symbol of a broken system, one that still echoes in modern debates on mental health care, stigma, and justice. His ordeal warns us of the dangers in assuming madness as a mere performance, and the devastating cost when society fails to listen to those who suffer. In the end, the man who faked madness did not just expose the cruelty of an era. He revealed the enduring struggle for voice and recognition faced by the mentally ill, a struggle that continues to this day. The mother who disappeared after a miscarriage in the cold shadows of Victorian England. Beneath the veneer of strict morality and social order, thousands of women suffered a tragedy so profound it was silenced by shame and fear. Loss of a child before birth was not just a private heartbreak. It became a mark of supposed mental frailty, a stigma so severe that it often condemned grieving mothers to the cold, lonely walls of asylums. Victorian doctors, steeped in ignorance and prejudice, dismissed miscarriage as nothing more than a symptom of woman's mental weakness, a moral and psychological failing, rather than a natural tragedy. This cruel misunderstanding erased women's pain and turned grief into punishment. In an era when motherhood was enshrined as a woman's highest calling and the foundation of her identity, losing a child was often seen as a failure defect. In the delicate female constitution, the loss was not only physical but also social and psychological, compounded by the harsh judgment of families and communities. Instead of comfort or support, women were met with suspicion. Their emotions, raw and overwhelming, were pathologized. A grieving mother was recast as unstable, hysterical, or dangerously fragile. Thousands of these women were institutionalized under diagnoses like melancholia, nervous exhaustion, or the catch-all hysteria. Behind asylum doors, their stories faded into silence. Families, ashamed or unable to cope, sometimes abandoned them to a fate worse than death, forgotten and alone. The asylums were grim and unforgiving. Overcrowded wards, neglect, cold treatments, and harsh restraint were common. Medical understanding of miscarriage-related trauma was virtually non-existent, and the women suffered both from their loss and from brutal confinement. Many were locked away indefinitely, their voices muffled by the thick walls of mental institutions. They became ghosts in society's collective memory. Their existence reduced to medical records or nameless figures lost in rows of unmarked graves. The pain of miscarriage was transformed into a weapon of control, used to silence women's suffering and maintain rigid social norms. The intersection of gender, grief, and mental health created a deadly trap, one from which many never returned. The societal pressure to embody strength and resilience masked the truth of these women's experiences. The Victorian ideal demanded women to be paragons of virtue, patient and self-sacrificing mothers. Any deviation invited harsh condemnation. The loss of a child shattered not only the woman's heart, but her entire social standing. Institutions that were supposed to heal became prisons of despair, reinforcing the stigma that deepened the isolation of women who had already endured unbearable loss. History tells of countless women whose lives were irreparably damaged by this cruel misunderstanding. Their mental anguish, born from grief and trauma, was met with neglect and punishment. Families sometimes turned away, unwilling to face the stigma or unable to help. The women vanished into the asylum system, many dying there quietly, their stories buried alongside them in unmarked graves that remained forgotten to this day. It took decades of medical and social progress before the profound psychological impact of miscarriage was acknowledged. Today, postpartum and perinatal mental health receive growing attention. But the scars of Victorian-era cruelty still echo in the stigma surrounding pregnancy loss. Remembering these lost women is vital. Their stories reveal the cost of misunderstanding and the dangers of equating grief with weakness. As you hear this, imagine the countless mothers who disappeared into the fog of history after losing their children, women whose pain was invisible, whose suffering was erased. Their voices may have been silenced, but their legacy calls us to compassion and to a deeper understanding of grief. It warns us to never dismiss the complexity of a mother's heart, to recognize that beneath every loss lies profound human resilience, demanding respect and care. The electroshock room with no exit, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, today is often shrouded in stigma and horror stories. But its origins are even darker and more harrowing than most realize. In the earliest days, this brutal procedure was administered without anesthesia, without restraint, and without consent. Patients were forced into the electric chair, or more accurately, the shock room, with no way out, no mercy, no dignity. The idea behind ECT was born from desperate attempts to treat severe mental illness when no effective therapies existed. Doctors believed jolting the brain with electricity could reset madness. A crude experiment driven more by hope and fear than scientific evidence. But in practice, early electroshock was a nightmarish ordeal. Patients were often strapped down, but sometimes not, and the shocks were delivered with terrifying unpredictability. Without anesthesia, the convulsions caused by the electricity were violent and painful. Muscles would spasm uncontrollably, bones fractured, and bodies writhed in agony. There was no sedation to dull the horror, no restraints to protect the body. From self-injury, the human cost was devastating. Some patients died from the seizures triggered by the shocks. Others were left permanently paralyzed, their nervous systems ravaged by the brutal currents coursing through their brains. The electroshock room became a place of terror, an electric cage with no exit, where the screams of suffering echoed. Unheard, beyond cold institutional walls, consent was never sought. Patients, often vulnerable and powerless, were subjected to ECT as a form of punishment or control. It was wielded as a tool to enforce silence, obedience, and submission. The medical establishment justified this cruelty as necessary treatment, but in reality, it was a systematic violation of human rights. The procedure was shrouded in secrecy. Families were often kept in the dark, and the public knew little of the true nature of ECT. It was administered in hidden chambers, where the vulnerable were electrocuted not to heal, but to silence. This dark chapter of psychiatry reveals how fear and ignorance can lead to profound suffering. Over time, anesthesia and muscle relaxants were introduced, reducing physical harm. Consent became a standard, though even today debates rage over ECT's ethical use. But those early years stand as a stark reminder of how medicine can become a weapon when compassion is absent. The electroshock room with no exit symbolizes more than just a procedure. It represents a time when patients were stripped of their humanity and dignity. It calls us to remember those who suffered in silence and to ensure modern medicine always honors the rights and voices of the vulnerable. Reflecting on this grim history compels us to question, how far have we truly come? How many treatments today carry hidden shadows of coercion and pain? The legacy of early electroshock therapy is a cautionary tale, urging vigilance, empathy, and unyielding respect for human life. The moral treatment that meant beatings in the early days of mental health care, a hopeful idea took root, what came to be known as moral treatment. It was heralded as a revolutionary approach that promised kindness, dignity, and reform for the mentally ill. Instead of chains and cruelty, doctors and reformers pledged compassion and order. They believed that mental illness could be cured through humane care, structured routines, and a calm environment. But beneath the veneer of morality lurked a harsher reality. The so-called moral treatment often translated into brutal practices: solitary confinement, physical restraints, starvation, and systematic beatings. The moral treatment was less about healing and more about control. To understand this dark paradox, we must travel back to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a period when asylums began shifting away from overt barbarism toward a more civilized approach. Reformers like Philippe Pinel in France and William Toke in England championed the idea that patients should be treated as human beings, deserving of kindness and moral guidance. These pioneers rejected the popular use of chains and whips, envisioning asylums as sanctuaries where the disturbed could find peace and restoration. Yet, this new moral framework came with its own strict rules. Patients were expected to adhere to disciplined routines, regulated meals, fixed bedtimes, work, and prayer. Obedience was the cornerstone. Those who complied could expect mild comforts and the promise of improvement. But those who resisted, those whose minds or bodies rebelled against confinement and rigid control, faced severe punishment. Solitary confinement became a favored tool to isolate patients deemed dangerous or disruptive. Locked away in small, dark rooms, these individuals faced sensory deprivation and crushing loneliness. Far from therapeutic, isolation often deepened despair and madness. It was a psychological weapon disguised as moral correction. Physical restraint, devices, straitjackets, chains, manacles were rebranded as protective measures designed to prevent harm. Yet, these devices inflicted pain and humiliation, stripping away autonomy. The restraints were applied not just to prevent violence, but to enforce submission. Resistance was met with tighter confinement or harsher restraints. Starvation or severe dietary restriction was another hidden form of punishment. Patients who misbehaved were denied adequate food or subjected to strict fasting regimens. Malnutrition weakened their bodies and spirits, making them easier to control. This cruel tactic was justified under the guise of moral discipline and bodily purification. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of moral treatment was the regular use of physical beatings. Though reformers condemned torture, many asylums maintained a regime of corporal punishment. Staff were authorized to administer beatings for disobedience, refusal to eat, or other transgressions. These punishments were often public, designed to intimidate and break the patient's will. Whips, rods, and fists enforced the law of the asylum with ruthless efficiency. Historical records reveal harrowing testimonies from patients and whistleblowers who endured these abuses. Some described endless days of confinement interrupted only by violent punishment. Others spoke of staff cruelty hidden behind official reports praising the asylum's moral regime. The reality was that many patients lived in fear, their bodies and minds battered in the name of reform. The moral treatment's promise of kindness was a carefully constructed illusion. While some patients experienced genuine moments of care and relative peace, countless others suffered deeply. The asylum became a place where power dynamics ruled, where conformity was enforced through fear and pain, and where mental illness was managed through submission rather than cure. This legacy exposes a painful truth: the boundary between care and cruelty in psychiatric history has often been disturbingly thin. Even good intentions, when combined with ignorance and institutional power, can lead to suffering. The moral treatment was not a triumph of humanity, but a complex and flawed attempt to impose order on chaos. Today, we recognize that humane care means more than routines and rules. It demands respect for patient autonomy, understanding of psychological trauma, and treatments grounded in science and compassion. The abuses hidden behind the moral treatments facade remind us to remain vigilant against any system that uses control disguised as care. The story of moral treatment is a sobering chapter in the history of psychiatry. It teaches us that true healing requires more than discipline. It requires empathy, insight, and the courage to confront our darkest mistakes. The beatings that masked themselves as moral reform call us to remember the cost of misguided compassion and the human lives forever marked by it. The child raised behind asylum walls, children born behind asylum walls, lived lives shadowed by trauma and neglect, confined within the same grim institutions that held their mothers. In Victorian times, when a woman was committed to a mental asylum, her child often had no option but to grow up in that harsh environment, isolated from the outside world, and denied a normal childhood. These children were born into a world steeped in suffering, where the echoes of their mother's struggles surrounded them, and their own identities were shaped by the oppressive walls that enclosed them. The practice of keeping children with their institutionalized mothers reflected a complex mixture of social attitudes and practical considerations. Society feared the spread of mental illness and stigma, and so children born in asylums were viewed through the same lens of suspicion, an inherent defect. They were frequently labeled mentally unfit or feeble-minded simply because of their origins, a presumption that condemned many to lifelong marginalization without fair assessment or hope for escape. Within the asylum, children were exposed to conditions that were anything but nurturing. The institutions were overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded, often focused on containment rather than care. Children experienced neglect, deprivation, and exposure to trauma witnessing their mother's distress, suffering alongside them in a place devoid of warmth or safety. The psychological impact of growing up in such a place was profound. From early childhood, these children faced emotional abandonment, social isolation, and limited stimulation, all of which stunted their development. The Victorian mindset linked heredity tightly with madness, and the children born in asylums were often seen as doomed by nature, presumed carriers of insanity. This belief led to policies that further marginalized these children, restricting their access to education and proper healthcare. Many were shuffled between institutions or placed in workhouses, where conditions were similarly harsh, effectively cutting them off from any possibility of normal social integration. Historical accounts tell of children growing up in bleak wards, their days marked by routines designed for adults, not for the tender needs of childhood. Play, affection, and learning were scarce commodities. Instead, the environment was often cold, regimented, and punitive, contributing to cycles of trauma that extended across generations. The presence of children in asylums challenged the institution's role and exposed its failure to protect the most vulnerable. Some children managed to escape these fates through adoption or placement with relatives, but many remained trapped within the asylum system, their identities forever tied to the stigma of their birth. The mental health of these children was rarely evaluated on its own terms. The shadow of their mother's diagnoses hung heavily over them, shaping their lives with assumptions rather than understanding. The story of children raised behind asylum walls as a haunting chapter in the history of mental health care, revealing the intersections of stigma, neglect, and systemic failure. It highlights how institutions intended for treatment often perpetuated cycles of suffering and exclusion. These children, born into silence and isolation, represent lives overshadowed by society's fears and failures. Looking back, their experiences force us to confront the dark legacy of past mental health policies and to recognize the importance of nurturing individualized care for vulnerable children today. They remind us that the roots of trauma can be deep and intertwined, and healing requires breaking free from the shadows cast by stigma and neglect. The child raised behind asylum walls was not just a statistic, but a living testament to resilience. Amid hardship, their survival calls for remembrance and reflection, urging us to ensure that no child is ever again condemned by the circumstances of their birth or trapped by the walls meant to heal. The artist who painted his way to freedom in the shadows of Victorian England, where madness was feared and misunderstood, one man's tortured genius blossomed behind the locked doors of an asylum. Richard Dadd, a gifted painter, found himself confined not for his art but for a tragic crime, the murder of his own father. Yet, within the bleak walls of Bedlam Hospital, Dadd transformed his torment into haunting masterpieces that continue to captivate and mystify us today. Born in 1817, Dadd was a prodigy from a young age. His talent was undeniable, his brushstrokes delicate and precise, his imagination vivid beyond his years. He studied at the Royal Academy of Arts and quickly earned a reputation for his detailed, fantastical paintings. But beneath the surface of artistic brilliance lurked a mind unraveling under pressure and mental illness. In 1843, during a trip to the Middle East, where he sought inspiration, Dadd's behavior began to change drastically. Paranoia and delusions took root. Returning to England, his mind darkened further. Tragically, in a moment consumed by psychosis, Dadd killed his father, an act that shocked a society already wary of mental illness. Declared criminally insane, he was institutionalized, confined for the remainder of his life. Yet, it was inside the asylum where Richard Dadd's true legacy emerged. Stripped of freedom but not creativity, he painted prolifically. His canvases were filled with intricate, otherworldly scenes, fairies, demons, and mysterious landscapes teeming with symbolic detail. Each brushstroke was a glimpse into his fractured psyche, a dialogue between madness and genius. Dadd's masterpiece. The Fairyfellas masterstroke took 9 years to complete. It is a densely packed composition, where every figure seems alive with a story, frozen in a moment of magical tension. The painting is not just an artwork, it's a window into a mind wrestling with chaos, trying to impose order through beauty and meticulous craftsmanship. Within the asylum walls, art became Dad's sanctuary, his voice when words failed. His paintings were his escape and his confession. They reveal his internal battles with delusions and demons, his desire for control, and his profound sensitivity to the world around him. The fine detail and obsessive precision suggest a mind clinging to reason amid madness. Richard Dad's story challenges the simplistic divide between sanity and insanity. His works ask us to reconsider the nature of creativity, especially when birthed from pain and suffering. They remind us that mental illness can coexist with brilliance, that beauty can emerge from the darkest places, and that the human spirit can seek freedom in expression, even when physically confined. For decades, Dad's paintings were hidden from public view, locked away with the man who created them. But, as time passed, appreciation for his unique vision grew. Today, his works are studied in museums and art schools worldwide, symbols of the complex relationship between art and the mind. Dad's life was marked by tragedy and isolation, yet his legacy is one of resilience and artistic triumph. Through his haunting images, he transcended the walls that imprisoned him, speaking across time to all who witness his intricate visions. His art is a testament to how the creative impulse can survive and even flourish amid suffering. In the broader context, Dad's life raises important questions about how society treats those with mental illness. His confinement was a product of Victorian fears and limited understanding, yet it was also where he created some of his greatest work. His story urges compassion and recognition for the talents and humanity of those struggling with mental health. The artist who painted his way to freedom did so not with keys or force, but with brushes and pigments. Richard Dad's masterpieces remain haunting reminders of a brilliant mind caught between worlds, expressing truths no words could contain. His work continues to inspire, provoke, and puzzle, inviting us to look deeper into the interplay of genius and madness. In every stroke lies the story of a man who found a measure of liberation through art, even when the world had turned its back on him. The asylum, where women were admitted for reading novels in the Victorian era, a time cloaked in strict social codes and rigid gender roles. Even the innocent act of reading a novel could become a mark of deviance, dangerous indulgence, leading women straight to the asylum. Medical records from the 1800s reveal a chilling truth. Women were institutionalized not for crimes or overt madness, but for reading too many works of fiction. This was seen by doctors as a cause of nervous overstimulation, a fragile female mind overwhelmed by the vivid emotions and fantastical ideas unleashed from the pages of novels. The very books that offered escape and imagination became a trap, a pathway to confinement and silence. At the heart of this dark chapter lies the Victorian obsession with controlling female behavior and thought. Women were expected to embody virtue, modesty, and passivity, prescribed role that left little room for intellectual curiosity or emotional complexity. Reading novels, especially the popular romances and Gothic tales of the time, was considered a dangerous indulgence that could inflame the passions, weaken nerves, and distort reality. To physicians, this overconsumption of fiction was not mere entertainment but a threat to mental stability, capable of triggering hysteria, anxiety, or mania. Asylums became the final refuge for many women who dared to cross this invisible line. Medical case notes describe women admitted for symptoms attributed to their voracious reading habits, palpitations, fainting spells, confusion, and emotional outbursts. The diagnosis of nervous overstimulation was a catch-all label, used to pathologize women's intellectual and emotional lives. Once inside the asylum, these women were subjected to treatments that ranged from the benign to the brutal rest cures that enforced isolation, enforced bed rest, cold baths, and sometimes restraint. This phenomenon was not merely about medical misunderstanding, it reflected deeper societal anxieties. Novels were seen as corrupting influences that challenged social order, stirred dangerous desires, and encouraged women to imagine lives beyond domestic confines. The act of reading became a form of rebellion, a threat to a culture that sought to keep women contained both physically and mentally. To label this rebellion as illness allowed families and doctors to justify institutionalization and silence. The stories of these women, largely lost to history, speak volumes about the intersection of gender, power, and mental health. Women who sought refuge in books found themselves punished for their imagination. Families, fearful of scandal or unable to comprehend the women's distress, sometimes consented to their confinement. Within asylum walls, these women often faded into anonymity, their vibrant inner lives reduced to symptoms on a page, their fates sealed by cultural fears rather than medical facts. It was only much later, through advances in psychiatry and shifting social attitudes, that reading was reclaimed as a source of knowledge and empowerment rather than a sign of madness. Today, the notion that a woman's mind could be undone by literature seems almost absurd. Yet, the history of women institutionalized for reading reminds us of how fragile freedom of thought once was, and how easily curiosity was criminalized. As you listen, imagine the countless women who found joy, comfort, and escape within the pages of novels, only to be punished by the very society that forbade their dreams. Remember that behind every medical record lies a woman's story, a story of courage, of repression, and of the human spirit's longing to break free. This chapter in history challenges us to protect intellectual freedom and to question how we define sanity and strength. The patient who became a number in the shadowed corridors of Victorian asylums. Something chilling took place, practice designed not to heal, but to erase. Patients were stripped of their names, their histories, their very identities, reduced to mere numbers. This cold system of depersonalization was seen by asylum administrators as a way to manage madness. But in reality, it was a brutal mechanism to obliterate humanity. Among countless lost souls, one woman's story stands out. For 37 long years, from the moment she was admitted until her death, she was known only by a number. Her name vanished from all records. Her identity erased as though she had never existed. Not a woman with a life, a family, or a past, but a number, a file, a statistic in the vast machinery of Victorian mental health. The Victorian era was marked by rapid industrialization and urbanization, which brought with it increased social anxieties and an explosion in asylum populations. These institutions, often overcrowded and underfunded, sought order through ruthless efficiency. Names were cumbersome. Numbers were neat, impersonal, and easy to file. In the eyes of the administrators, this depersonalization helped control the unpredictable chaos of mental illness. But the consequences were devastating. To be assigned a number was to be rendered invisible. Patients lost not just their names, but their voices, their dignity, and their place in the world. Staff spoke about them in cold clinical terms, and even their families struggled to reach through the impersonal barrier of bureaucracy. This woman's story is a stark testament to the erasure suffered by many. When she entered the asylum, she was a person with memories and relationships. But inside, the institution rewrote her reality. Her number became her entire existence. Letters, no visits, no acknowledgement beyond that digit. Over time, her name faded from memory, even among those who cared for her. The psychological toll was profound. Identity is foundational to human experience. Without it, isolation becomes a prison within a prison. The woman's confinement was not just physical, but existential. She endured decades of silence and invisibility, trapped by a system that viewed her not as a human being, but as an object to be managed. Victorian asylum records reveal this practice was widespread, with many patients similarly depersonalized. This bureaucratic violence was hidden behind clinical language, but echoed a deep societal fear of madness and difference. The numbering system symbolized the broader stigma and exclusion faced by those labeled insane. Her death marked the final erasure, the loss, not just of life, but of personhood. Yet, uncovering her story centuries later challenges us to confront the dark legacy of psychiatric institutions. It forces a reckoning with how systems can dehumanize in the name of care. Today, her forgotten name is reclaimed as a symbol of resistance against such erasure. Her life urges us to uphold the dignity and humanity of all people, especially the vulnerable. It reminds us that behind every diagnosis is a person, not a number. The lessons of her story resonate still, warning against reducing individuals to statistics or labels. It calls on us to listen deeply, to honor identity, and to fight the silence imposed by neglect and stigma. In remembering her, we restore her voice, her name, and her humanity. We bear witness to a past that should never be repeated and commit to a future where every person is seen, heard, and valued beyond any number. The straitjacket that became a death trap in the shadowed halls of 19th and early 20th century asylums. One device came to symbolize both control and tragedy. The straitjacket, marketed as a humane alternative to chains and shackles, promised to restrain without causing permanent harm. But the grim reality was far darker. For some patients, the straitjacket became a slow, merciless death trap worn for weeks without removal. It led to devastating infections, suffocation, and unbearable agony. These tragic outcomes are not mere rumors or isolated incidents. They are well documented in asylum records, hidden in official logs and forgotten reports. To understand how the straitjacket evolved from a tool of restraint to an instrument of death, we must first consider the asylum environment it was born into. Mental institutions of the era were often overcrowded and underfunded. Staff were overwhelmed, and the challenge of managing patients prone to agitation, violence, or self-harm was immense. The straitjacket was introduced as a practical solution, immobilizing garment of heavy canvas with long sleeves designed to be tied tightly behind the back, restricting arm movement completely. Its purpose was to prevent patients from injuring themselves or others. However, the straitjacket's design had inherent risks. Once secured, patients could not free their arms or adjust their posture. Without frequent supervision and care, prolonged immobilization led to pressure sores, circulation problems, and muscle atrophy. The fabric could chafe the skin relentlessly, causing open wounds that became breeding grounds for infection. In the damp, unsanitary conditions of many asylums, these wounds festered unchecked. More alarmingly, the straitjacket sometimes contributed directly to death by asphyxiation. Restrained patients, unable to reposition themselves or signal distress, effectively could become trapped in dangerous positions, heads bent too far forward, or bodies pressed against bedding or walls. Breathing became shallow or obstructed, and without prompt intervention, suffocation could occur. Cases of patients found dead, still tightly bound in their straitjackets, were chillingly frequent. Asylum records from the time offer haunting glimpses into these tragedies. Incident reports describe patients restrained continuously for days, sometimes weeks, with minimal removal for hygiene or care. Notes reference infections spreading from unhealed sores, causing fever and decline. Other entries mention sudden deaths attributed to natural causes but with circumstances strongly suggesting restraint-related suffocation. Families of the confined often knew nothing of these horrors. Communication between asylums and relatives was limited, and the culture of secrecy and stigma around mental illness allowed such neglect to persist. Even medical professionals at the time debated the ethics and safety of prolonged straitjacket use. But institutional practices rarely changed swiftly. The focus remained on containment rather than cure. The psychological torment of being trapped in a straitjacket cannot be overstated. Patients were isolated, immobilized, and vulnerable, forced into a powerless state where panic, despair, and helplessness festered. This mental suffering compounded physical deterioration, deepening the cycle of decline. It is crucial to remember that the straitjacket was not universally applied as a death sentence. Some patients were restrained briefly, carefully monitored, and eventually released. But the systemic failures, overcrowding, understaffing, lack of medical oversight meant that many suffered fatal consequences. The straitjacket's promise as a humane tool was betrayed by the conditions of its use. Modern psychiatry has rejected such dangerous restraint practices, guided by advances in medical ethics, human rights, and understanding of trauma. Restraints today, when used at all, are tightly regulated, time-limited, and combined with compassionate care. But the straitjacket's dark history lingers as a cautionary tale of how tools designed for protection can become instruments of suffering when misused. Reflecting on this history compels us to honor those who endured these conditions and to recognize the importance of vigilance in safeguarding patient dignity and life. The straitjacket that became a death trap is a stark reminder that restraint without care is cruelty, and that the human cost of mental health treatment must never be forgotten. The day the asylum caught fire, and no one ran, in 1882, a devastating fire swept through a wing of a Manchester asylum, igniting chaos that should have sparked desperate flight. Yet, the halls echoed, not with screams or frantic footsteps, but with a haunting silence. Confused patients, conditioned by rigid rules and the oppressive atmosphere of the institution, sat quietly, unable or unwilling to flee. This tragedy was not merely the result of flames or smoke, but of a system that had stripped these vulnerable souls of their agency, leaving them trapped not only by walls but by obedience itself. Victorian asylums were places where control was paramount. Patients were often trained to follow strict protocols where disobedience was met with punishment or isolation. The no-talking rules, enforced silences, and enforced passivity created an environment where patients lost the ability to advocate for themselves. On that fateful day, the fire illuminated this grim reality in the most tragic way possible. As smoke crept through the corridors, many patients did not react with fear or urgency. Instead, they remained subdued, trapped in the mental chains. Forged by years of enforced compliance, the fire began quietly but spread rapidly. Staff members scrambled to evacuate, but the confusion and sheer scale overwhelmed their efforts. Many patients were physically restrained or confined to locked wards, a common practice meant to prevent escape, but which now became a deadly cage. The deafening silence was pierced only by the crackling of flames and the panicked shouts of attendants. Yet, the patients, many of whom could not fully comprehend the danger, remained still, as if frozen by the rules that governed their daily existence. Historical accounts reveal a scene of tragic inertia. The very discipline imposed to maintain order became a fatal flaw. Patients conditioned to obedience sat immobilized, their survival instincts blunted by institutionalized control. Some staff risked their own lives attempting to rouse and rescue those trapped in smoke-filled rooms. Others struggled to unlock wards and carry those who could not move themselves to safety. But the slow response, hindered by the very rules meant to keep the asylum functional, meant many lives were lost that day. This disaster exposed the catastrophic consequences of a system that prioritized control over care. The fire was not just a physical destruction, but a metaphor for the violence of enforced silence and passivity. The patient's silence was not peace, but a symptom of their profound disempowerment. The tragedy sparked debate in medical and social circles about the treatment of the mentally ill, forcing a reckoning with the harsh realities hidden behind asylum walls. Yet, change came slowly. Victorian society was still steeped in fear and misunderstanding about mental illness. The Manchester fire became a somber cautionary tale, illustrating how rigid systems can fail those they intend to protect. It highlighted the need for reforms emphasizing dignity, communication, and empowerment in psychiatric care. The day the asylum caught fire and no one ran remains a haunting reminder of the human cost of silence imposed by fear and control. It challenges us to remember that safety is not just about walls and rules, but about nurturing the voice and agency of every individual, especially the most vulnerable. Through this tragedy, history teaches us that true care must be rooted in respect, empathy, and freedom, not in silence and obedience. The doctor who declared grief a mental illness in the annals of psychiatric history. Few chapters are as chilling and revealing as the pathologization of grief. During the Victorian era, mourning was transformed from a natural human process into a medical diagnosis, a dangerous invention that blurred the boundaries between sorrow and insanity. At the heart of this transformation was a doctor whose ideas reshaped how society viewed bereavement, condemning those who mourned too long to the cold walls of asylums, often for the rest of their lives. In the 19th century, death was a ubiquitous presence. Life expectancy was lower, disease rampant, and the loss of a spouse, child, or parent was tragically common. Grief was not merely expected, it was written. Elaborate customs governed mourning periods, with widows wearing black for years, expressing sorrow openly and profoundly. Yet beneath these customs lurked a growing anxiety about the emotional and mental stability of mourners. Dr. Thomas Laycock, a prominent psychiatrist of the mid-1800s, among others, advanced the notion that grief, when prolonged beyond certain societal norms, was a pathological condition. This idea found fertile ground in a culture already fearful of mental instability. Mourning, especially among widows, was scrutinized under the lens of medical science, and those deemed excessively grief-stricken were labeled unstable or hysterical. The Victorian medical establishment developed diagnostic criteria that criminalized natural sorrow. Symptoms like tearfulness, withdrawal, insomnia, and persistent sadness were interpreted as signs of mental derangement rather than understandable human responses. The label of melancholia or nervous exhaustion became catch-all diagnoses for those unable to resume their roles in society promptly. For many widows, the consequences were devastating. In a society that prized female virtue and emotional control, failure to move on was seen not only as personal weakness, but as dangerous instability. Families and doctors alike sometimes colluded to have grieving women committed to asylums, institutions rife with neglect and abuse. Inside those walls, the natural process of mourning was arrested, replaced by isolation, forced treatments, and indefinite confinement. The pathologization of grief served multiple purposes beyond medicine. It reinforced social norms about gender, behavior, and emotional expression. Women were expected to embody stoicism and resilience. Deviation from this was medicalized and punished. The asylum system, already overwhelmed, became a tool of social control. Punishing those who did not conform to prescribed mourning treatment methods offered little comfort. Patients diagnosed with grief illness were subjected to sedatives, restraints, and moral therapies designed to suppress their sorrow. Rather than support healing, these approaches often deepened trauma and alienation. The line between mental illness and justified sorrow was obliterated, leaving many trapped in cycles of despair and institutionalization. The legacy of this era is a stark warning about the dangers of medicalizing normal human emotions. It reveals how psychiatric authority can be wielded to control and marginalize, particularly women. The story of widows confined for their grief exposes the cruelty of a system that valued conformity over compassion, diagnosis over understanding. Modern psychology has since recognized grief as a natural, albeit painful, process with no fixed timeline. Yet echoes of these Victorian practices persist in the stigma around mourning and mental health. The history of grief as a diagnosed illness reminds us to question how culture, medicine, and power intersect to shape definitions of normalcy. The doctor who declared grief a mental illness may have believed he was advancing science, but in reality, he helped erect walls around the hearts of countless mourners. His legacy is not just in textbooks, but in the silenced voices of those who suffered in the name of treatment. Today, as we honor those who grieve, we remember this dark chapter and strive for a more humane understanding of sorrow, recognition that grief, in all its forms, is a testament to love, not a symptom to be erased. The whispering halls of Bedlam in the heart of London, where narrow streets twist like serpents beneath fog and gaslight, stands a place both feared and infamous, Bedlam Royal Hospital. Known to the world as Bedlam, it is the oldest institution dedicated to the care of the mentally ill, but its history is stained with cruelty and spectacle, where suffering was not only endured behind locked doors, but was twisted into public entertainment. For centuries, the whispering halls of Bedlam echoed not just with the cries of the tormented, but with the curious footsteps of visitors who paid to gaze upon human misery as if it were a grotesque theatre performance. Bethlем's story begins in the 13th century, originally founded as a religious institution for the poor and sick. Yet by the 16th and 17th centuries, it transformed into a place where those labeled mad were confined, often indefinitely. The term Bedlam itself became synonymous with chaos and madness, reflecting the conditions inside. Patients were subjected to overcrowded wards, unsanitary conditions, and brutal treatments. But what set Bedlam apart and darkened its legacy was the public's access to the inmates. Entry tickets were sold, and visitors flocked to the hospital, not for healing or sympathy, but for curiosity and amusement. The spectacle was horrifying. Men and women, stripped of dignity and autonomy, were paraded before crowds as if they were animals in a cage. People came to witness raving lunatics, shouting, writhing, and sometimes violently thrashing. This public display fed on the heiress fascination with the exotic and the grotesque, blurring the lines between care and cruelty. Medical understanding of mental illness was primitive, and fear of the unknown fueled a voyeuristic obsession. The patients were othered, reduced to objects of mockery or fear, their humanity erased. Behind the scenes, conditions were nightmarish. The hospital's wards were cramped and filthy, with minimal hygiene and scant medical care. Restraints such as chains and straitjackets were common, and treatments ranged from bloodletting to cold water dousing. Many patients suffered from neglect, malnutrition, and abuse. Escape was nearly impossible, and the social stigma ensured that few outside the hospital spoke of what went on within. The walls of Bedlam became a prison of flesh and mind. Yet, amidst this darkness, voices of reform slowly emerged. By the 18th century, figures like William Batty challenged the notion that mental illness was incurable, advocating for more humane treatment. The spectacle of public viewing was criticized and gradually abolished, but the stigma and harsh realities endured. Bedlam's evolution mirrors society's shifting attitudes toward mental health from fear and fascination to understanding and compassion. The legacy of Bedlam is a stark reminder of how society has often turned vulnerability into spectacle, and how those suffering from mental illness were denied basic dignity and rights. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the history of psychiatric care and the thin line between care and control. The whispers that once filled its halls now speak to us across time, urging a reckoning with past injustices and a commitment to empathy. Imagine the countless souls who lived and died within Bedlam's walls, their cries unheard beyond the curious crowds. Remember that behind the spectacle were human beings, fragile, suffering, deserving of kindness rather than scorn. Their story compels us to honor their memory by fostering a world where mental illness is met with understanding, not entertainment, where the halls of care whisper hope, not despair. The man committed for political opinions in an era when dissent was not merely discouraged, but criminalized. Expressing political opinions deemed dangerous could cost a person their freedom, not just behind prison bars, but within the cold, unyielding walls of an asylum. History reveals a dark intersection where mental health was weaponized to silence voices of resistance, and political activists were declared insane simply for criticizing the crown. Imagine a time when the right to speak your mind was shackled by fear. Governments and monarchies faced threats not only from rebellion, but from ideas powerful enough to inspire change. To maintain control, ruling powers employed a sinister tactic, labeling political dissenters as mentally unstable, unfit for society, and committing them to asylums indefinitely. One man's story exemplifies this grim reality. His crime was speaking truth to power, questioning authority, criticizing unjust rule, and advocating for rights. Instead of facing a public trial, he was declared insane, stripped of agency, and locked away. His imprisonment was justified not by evidence of mental illness, but by the dangerousness of his beliefs. Victorian and earlier institutions often functioned as tools of political repression. The medical language of madness cloaked political persecution in a veneer of legitimacy. Diagnoses such as mania, delusions, or hysteria were applied loosely, frequently to those who challenged the established order. Being labeled insane stripped individuals of legal rights, public voice, and social standing. In these asylums, political prisoners were isolated from society, their dissent silenced by enforced silence and confinement. Families were coerced or complicit, fearing scandal or reprisals. Records show many activists languished for years, sometimes decades, under this cruel guise, their true offense erased beneath clinical euphemisms. The consequences were profound. Political ideas that threatened entrenched power were crushed, not with debate, but with medicalized control. Mental health became a battlefield where truth was silenced and freedom was denied. The asylum, ostensibly a place of care, became a prison for conviction. This dark history is rarely told, yet it speaks volumes about the fragility of rights and the ease with which institutions can be corrupted. It forces us to examine how power can redefine reality, pathologizing dissent and weaponizing psychiatry against the brave few who dared to resist. Today, remembering this man and others like him is an act of defiance against historical injustice. It compels us to safeguard freedom of expression and to scrutinize the misuse of medical authority. It reminds us that mental health diagnoses must never be tools of oppression or censorship. His story challenges modern society. How do we protect political dissent in the face of systemic control? How do we ensure that psychiatry serves healing rather than suppression? The echoes of his imprisonment warn us that the line between sanity and dissent can be perilously thin when power fears the truth. In honoring his memory, we reclaim the right to speak, to challenge, and to resist. We commit to a world where political opinions are not grounds for confinement, but seeds for dialogue and progress. His life and suffering remind us that justice and freedom must always outpace fear and control. The nurse who tried to expose the horror behind the locked doors of 19th century asylums, where the desperate cries of patients echoed through cold, silent halls, a quiet but fierce resistance was born. Nurse Margaret Vaughan was one of the few voices who dared to speak out against the crushing horrors she witnessed daily. Working inside these institutions, she bore witness to unimaginable suffering patients, starving, screaming in torment, and left to wither in neglect. Her secret letters, preserved through time, revealed the grim reality that official records tried to erase, and the profound bravery of a woman determined to expose the truth. Margaret Vaughan was no ordinary nurse. At a time when mental illness was heavily stigmatized, and asylums were places many feared to acknowledge, she chose to enter a world shrouded in silence and secrecy. Her training was rigorous, but her true education came in the wards, amid patients stripped of dignity and humanity. From the outset, she realized that the treatment meted out was less about healing and more about containment, control, and often, cruelty. In her private letters, never meant for public eyes, Margaret detailed a landscape of despair. She wrote of patients so starved that their bodies were skeletal, yet still denied proper nutrition as a twisted form of punishment or cost-cutting. Hunger gnawed at their minds as much as their bodies, fueling agitation and despair. They screamed not just from pain, but from the terror of being trapped in a living nightmare with no hope for relief. Margaret described the silence that fell over the wards, not the calm of peace, but the haunting quiet of ignored cries. Staff were overwhelmed or indifferent, sometimes cruel. Patients who begged for help were left unanswered. Some were locked away in isolation cells, forgotten for days. Others were restrained in straitjackets or confined to small dark rooms where they could only tremble in loneliness. What made Margaret Vaughan's testimony so remarkable was her insistence on seeing the patients as human beings, not just cases or mad. She observed their suffering with empathy, documenting their pain with painstaking detail and a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would listen. Her words pierce the cold stone walls of the asylum and reach across centuries, demanding justice and compassion. Her letters were smuggled out in secrecy, hidden in books, or entrusted to trusted allies. Publishing or revealing such accounts was dangerous. Institutions feared scandal, and authorities sought to silence dissent. Margaret risked her career, reputation, and safety to shed light on the dark realities inside. For years, her efforts were met with silence or disbelief, but she persisted. Today, these letters stand as some of the most powerful first-hand accounts of asylum life during a period when mental health care was rife with neglect and abuse. They remind us that behind the clinical terms and cold reports were real people, and women caught in a system that often failed them utterly. Margaret Vaughan's courage challenges us to reflect on the legacy of mental health care and the importance of vigilance, transparency, and compassion. Her story is a testament to the power of bearing witness, the moral obligation to speak truth to power, and the resilience of the human spirit amidst suffering. As we remember Nurse Margaret Vaughan, we honor not only her bravery but the countless patients whose silent screams she gave voice to. Her letters are a lasting call to action, a reminder that no system, no matter how entrenched, should be allowed to hide its darkness behind locked doors. The doctor who created the lobotomy list, Dr. Walter Freeman, stands as one of the most controversial figures in the history of psychiatric medicine. A man whose legacy is intertwined with one of the darkest chapters of mental health treatment, the lobotomy. His work not only shaped practices in the United States, but also rippled across the Atlantic, deeply influencing British asylums and their approach to managing mental illness. The lobotomy, heralded by some as a revolutionary treatment, became a tool of permanent damage, a cruel intervention that sought to make patients easier to control by severing their very capacity for emotion and thought. In the early 20th century, psychiatry was desperate for solutions to treat mental illnesses that seemed untreatable by the limited means of the time. Conditions like schizophrenia, severe depression, and obsessive behaviors were considered incurable, leaving families and institutions searching for hope. Dr. Freeman, an American neurologist, introduced the transorbital lobotomy procedure, where an instrument was inserted behind the eye socket to sever connections in the brain's frontal lobes. It was quick, often performed in outpatient settings, and promoted as a miracle cure capable of calming violent or unmanageable patients. Freeman's zeal for the lobotomy was unmatched. He traveled widely, performing and teaching the procedure with evangelical fervor, turning it into a widespread practice by the 1940s and 1950s. The procedure's simplicity and promise of control appealed to many asylum doctors overwhelmed by overcrowded wards and limited resources. In Britain, where asylums struggled under similar pressures, Freeman's methods found eager adoption. The lobotomy list, a grim roster of patients deemed candidates for this irreversible surgery, grew steadily as psychiatrists sought to manage populations they found difficult or exhausting. But beneath the veneer of medical progress, the reality was brutal. The lobotomy did not cure. It irreversibly altered personalities, emotions, and cognition. Many patients were left apathetic, emotionally flat, and cognitively impaired, stripped of their humanity to render them docile. The procedure was often performed without proper consent, sometimes on vulnerable women, children, or institutionalized individuals who lacked the power to refuse. The easier-to-manage patients were effectively reduced to shells, their complex suffering replaced by a numb compliance that served the institution's need for order rather than the patient's well-being. The story of Dr. Freeman and his lobotomy list is a cautionary tale about the perils of medical hubris and dehumanization. It reveals how psychiatry, driven by desperation and systemic failings, crossed ethical boundaries in pursuit of control. Institutional overcrowding, lack of effective medication, and societal stigma created a climate where such drastic measures could flourish unchecked. Freeman's personal narrative is complex. He believed deeply in his work, convinced that he was offering relief when none existed before. Yet, his methods ignored the profound psychological and physical costs. His ice-pick lobotomy technique, quick and minimally surgical, became symbolic of reckless medical intervention. The public and professional reactions evolved over time from initial enthusiasm to growing horror as the devastating side effects became clear. British asylums, influenced by Freeman's example, incorporated lobotomies as part of their treatment arsenal. Official reports and patient records reveal the expansion of this practice, with lists of lobotomy candidates growing as a solution to the chronic overcrowding and challenging behaviors that plagued institutions. The scars of these procedures remained lifelong, both visible and invisible, as many survivors struggled with the loss of identity and autonomy. This dark history underscores the dangers inherent when the quest for control overshadows compassion and respect for human dignity. The lobotomy was not merely a medical procedure, but a form of social control, a means to silence, suppress, and isolate those deemed problematic. It was a brutal response to complex human suffering, reflecting broader societal fears about mental illness and difference. Today, the legacy of Dr. Walter Freeman and the lobotomy movement serves as a profound lesson for modern medicine and mental health care. It challenges practitioners to balance innovation with ethics, to prioritize patient rights, and to resist the temptation to simplify or erase human complexity for convenience. Advances in neuroscience, pharmacology, and psychotherapy have rendered lobotomies obsolete, but the echoes of that era remind us to remain vigilant against repeating such tragedies. Understanding this history is crucial not only to honor the victims who endured these irreversible harms, but to ensure that mental health care embraces empathy, consent, and dignity above all. The story of the doctor who created the lobotomy list is a stark reminder of how easily medicine can become a tool of oppression when humanity is lost in the pursuit of control. The forgotten cemeteries behind every asylum, behind the towering walls and iron gates of Victorian asylums, lie secrets buried. Beneath the earth-forgotten cemeteries where thousands of souls rest in unmarked graves, erased from memory and history alike, these silent burial grounds, scattered across the grounds of mental institutions, hold the remains of those society cast aside, their identities lost in the shadows of neglect and silence. During the 19th century, asylums swelled with patients, many of whom lived and died within their grim confines. Mental illness was poorly understood, treatments were harsh, and death was a common fate. Disease, malnutrition, and neglect claimed lives at a staggering rate. Yet the dying often received little more than basic care. When death came, it was met with a brutal indifference. The deceased patients were frequently buried on asylum grounds, not in consecrated churchyards or family plots, but in cemeteries that became little more than mass graves. These burial sites were typically unmarked, anonymous, and forgotten symbols of the dehumanization suffered by those deemed insane. Their names were rarely recorded properly, and the few records that existed were lost or destroyed over time. Families, when they existed or could be found, were often powerless to claim the bodies of their loved ones, either due to stigma, distance, or poverty. Many patients had no known relatives. The institutions treated death as a routine administrative matter, with little regard for dignity or remembrance. The dead were buried swiftly, cheaply, and without ceremony. This erasure of identity extended beyond death. Without gravestones or memorials, the patients' lives were effectively wiped from history. The cemeteries grew into forgotten fields of silence, their existence obscured by overgrown weeds, cracked bricks, and crumbling walls. The earth itself seemed to swallow the stories of those who died within asylum walls. In recent decades, historians and archaeologists have begun to uncover these lost burial grounds, piecing together fragments of records, maps, and oral histories. Each discovery is a poignant reminder of the human cost hidden beneath the clinical narratives of mental health history. The graves remind us that behind the statistics were individuals with lives, hopes, and suffering. The forgotten cemeteries challenge us to confront the legacy of Victorian psychiatry, the stigmatization, the neglect, and the profound loss of humanity. They compel us to remember those who were silenced, not just by their illness, but by the very system that was supposed to care for them. In honoring these forgotten dead, we acknowledge a painful chapter in the history of mental health care. We recognize the urgent need to restore dignity and respect to those who suffered in silence, and to ensure that their stories are not lost to the passage of time. The earth beneath Victorian asylums holds more than bones. It holds the echoes of forgotten lives, a testament to a time when the vulnerable were hidden away and erased. Their graves may be unmarked, but their memory demands to be reclaimed.